When German troops crossed the Polish frontier at dawn on September the 1st, 1939, most people in Europe still thought, or hoped, they were witnessing another limited crisis, another dispute that might be settled at the negotiating table. Instead, within a matter of days, the conflict in Poland would trigger a chain reaction that plunged the world into the most destructive war in human history. To understand why the invasion of Poland became the opening act of the Second World War, we have to go back to the end of the First. In 1918, as the German, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian empires collapsed under the strain of World War I and revolution, a country that had been wiped from the map over a century earlier suddenly reappeared. The Second Polish Republic declared its independence, attempting to stitch together territory from three fallen empires into a functioning state. Its western frontiers were defined largely by the Treaty of Versailles and related agreements, but the situation was far from settled. German nationalists bitterly resented the loss of lands now under Polish control, including the so-called Polish Corridor to the Baltic Sea and the separation of East Prussia from the rest of Germany. In the east, the borders were even more fluid. Between 1919 and 1921, Poland fought a brutal war with Soviet Russia. The fighting, which stretched from today's Belarus deep into Ukraine, ended with the Treaty of Riga in 1921. Poland gained substantial territory, but in Moscow, many Bolshevik leaders saw this as a temporary setback, not a final settlement. By the early 1930s, Poland was surrounded by powerful neighbors that viewed its existence with suspicion or hostility. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi movement condemned the Versailles settlement as a national humiliation. German propaganda repeatedly called for the return of lost territories and denounced the Polish corridor as a dagger cutting Germany in two. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin presided over a regime that believed the old Tsarist borderlands, including much of eastern Poland, were historically Russian or Ukrainian lands that had to be recovered sooner or later. Both dictatorships saw the Versailles Order not as the basis of stability, but as a structure to be torn down. Yet on the surface, the 1930s did not look like an inevitable march to war. Polish leaders understood their vulnerability and tried to balance between their two giant neighbors. In 1932, Warsaw signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. 2 years later, in 1934, Poland signed a similar agreement with Nazi Germany. The Polish government, authoritarian but not totalitarian, hoped that by maintaining correct relations with both Berlin and Moscow, it could buy time and preserve its independence until the European situation improved. For a while, that strategy seemed to work. But Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond revising a few borders. He had long envisioned a vast German empire, carved out of Eastern Europe, a project he called Lebensraum, or living space. Poland, in that vision, was not an equal neighbor, but an obstacle to be dismantled. Meanwhile, Stalin's aims remain debated to this day. Was he primarily interested in restoring old imperial frontiers, building a buffer zone against Germany, or seizing any territory that circumstances allowed? Whatever his exact motives, the Soviet leadership viewed Poles with deep suspicion, and during the Great Terror of 1937–38, tens of thousands of ethnic Poles inside the USSR were arrested, deported, or shot as supposed enemies of the people. The stage was being set for something darker than another border adjustment. The immediate crisis that led to war actually began not in Poland but in Czechoslovakia. In 1938, Hitler demanded control of the Sudetenland, a border region with a large ethnic German population. At the Munich conference in September, Britain and France, desperate to avoid another major war, agreed to let Germany annex the territory in exchange for Hitler's promise that he had no further territorial claims in Europe. Czechoslovakia, whose security they had guaranteed, was not even invited to the table. For many people, Munich became a symbol of appeasement, the hope that feeding Hitler one country at a time would preserve peace. For Polish leaders, Munich was a double-edged lesson. On the one hand, it showed that Britain and France were willing to sacrifice small states for the illusion of stability. On the other, it appeared to show that Germany's expansion might be limited and negotiable. In a controversial move, Poland took advantage of Czechoslovakia's weakness to seize a small disputed region of its own, with German consent. It was a decision that later damaged Poland's moral standing in the eyes of some foreign observers. But once Czechoslovakia was broken, Germany's gaze turned squarely toward Poland. In early 1939, German diplomats pressed Warsaw to accept far-reaching concessions. The incorporation of the free city of Danzig, today's Gdansk, into the Reich, and the construction of an extraterritorial highway and railway across the Polish corridor to link mainland Germany with East Prussia. On paper, these demands could be presented as technical adjustments. In reality, they would have turned Poland into a dependent satellite, with a foreign power controlling key infrastructure on its soil. The Polish government refused. Danzig was an overwhelmingly German city, but it was also a lifeline to the sea and a powerful symbol of independence. To give it up voluntarily would have sent a message of weakness at exactly the wrong moment. As tension rose, the Polish leadership increasingly looked to Britain and France for support. Paris already had a military alliance with Warsaw, but until 1938, Britain had been more reluctant to commit itself on the continent. Munich and then Germany's occupation of the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, in open violation of Hitler's promises, changed that calculation. In April 1939, Britain and France guaranteed Polish independence, promising to come to its aid if Germany attacked. For Polish commanders such as Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigły, the guarantee was both a lifeline and a gamble. Poland could not defeat Germany alone in a long war. Its best hope was to resist long enough for a powerful Allied offensive in the West to force Germany to divert forces or negotiate. Still, Hitler wanted to avoid a two-front war, at least at the start. The German High Command was not yet convinced the army had enough reserves, ammunition, or heavy weapons for a long struggle against both Western powers and the Soviet Union simultaneously. The solution that emerged in the summer of 1939 shocked public opinion around the world. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, sworn ideological enemies, suddenly began a secret diplomatic courtship. Each side saw advantages. Hitler wanted a free hand in Poland and access to Soviet raw materials. Stalin wanted time to rearm, a chance to push his borders westward, and the hope that capitalist states might bleed each other in a long war. On August 23, 1939, the foreign ministers of the two dictatorships, Vyacheslav Molotov for the Soviet Union and Joachim von Ribbentrop for Germany, signed a non-aggression pact in Moscow. The public text simply promised that each side would remain neutral if the other became involved in war. The secret protocol, unknown to the outside world at the time, went far beyond that. It divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Germany was given freedom of action in Western Poland and had its dominance in former Czechoslovakia recognized. The Soviet Union received a free hand in Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Eastern Poland, as well as a claim on Bessarabia, then part of Romania. Lithuania's fate was left somewhat ambiguous to be adjusted later. In effect, two dictators decided the fate of millions of people without a single vote cast or a single local representative present. With his eastern flank secured for the moment, Hitler moved quickly. In late August, German forces massed on Poland's borders. At the same time, Nazi security agencies prepared a series of false flag operations to provide a pretext for war. On the night of August 31st, SS units and special police commandos staged attacks on German targets near the frontier, including a radio station at Gleiwitz. Prisoners taken from concentration camps and a local pro-German activist were dressed in Polish uniforms, killed, and left at the scene to create the impression of Polish aggression. The operations themselves were clumsily executed, but they gave Hitler a ready-made story to present to the world. At around 4:45 in the morning, on September 1, 1939, German units launched a full-scale invasion from north, west, and south. Just off the coast at Danzig, the elderly German battleship, Schleswig-Holstein, ostensibly on a ceremonial visit, opened fire on the small Polish garrison at Westerplatte. In Berlin, Hitler claimed Germany was merely responding to Polish attacks and that German forces were returning fire. In reality, the attack was carefully planned under the code name Fall Weiss, Case White. The German plan aimed to encircle and destroy the Polish army quickly west of the Vistula River, from East Prussia in the north and from Silesia and Slovakia in the south. Armored and motorized divisions were to drive deep into Polish territory, bypassing strong points, cutting railway lines, and seizing key crossroads. Traditional infantry divisions, many still using horse-drawn transport, would then follow to mop up surrounded Polish units. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, would bombard Polish airfields, supply dumps, and communication nodes in the opening hours, seeking to blind and paralyze the defender. In modern terms, it was a campaign built around speed, coordination, and shock, the elements that later became associated with the popular idea of Blitzkrieg. On paper, the balance of forces heavily favored Germany. Roughly 1.5 million German soldiers, organized into around 50 divisions, took part in the attack, including several armored and motorized formations. They had about 2,000 tanks and a similar number of aircraft. The majority of their tanks were light models such as the Panzer IV and the Furt, or Czech-built machines, but they were numerous and well supported by radios and mobile artillery. Opposing them were about 1 million Polish soldiers, mobilized into around 38 infantry divisions, 1 motorized brigade, and several cavalry brigades. Poland did possess armored units and roughly 700 combat aircraft, but many were older models, and mobilization had been delayed under Allied pressure so as not to provoke Germany. As a result, when the invasion began, a significant portion of Polish units were still moving to their designated positions. Polish planners faced a terrible dilemma even before the first shot was fired. Concentrating their forces in a strong central position might have allowed a more effective defense in depth, but it would also mean abandoning vital industrial areas and major cities, and possibly undermining morale at home and support abroad. Scattering their forces along the frontier protected more territory in the short term, but made it harder to maneuver and reinforced Germany's advantage in mobility. In the end, the Polish High Command opted for a forward defense across a broad front, hoping to delay the Germans long enough for France to launch its promised offensive in the west. From the very first day, Polish troops fought with determination. At Westerplatte, fewer than 200 soldiers held out for a week under heavy bombardment, their resistance quickly becoming a symbol of national courage. In the countryside, Polish infantry and cavalry formations launched local counterattacks, ambushed advancing columns, and sometimes inflicted serious losses. At the Battle of Mokra on September the 1st, a Polish cavalry brigade fought German armored units to a standstill, using well-prepared positions, anti-tank guns, and skillful use of terrain. Polish cavalry did not charge tanks with lances, a persistent myth that emerged from confused reports of a clash at Krojanty, where mounted troops attacked German infantry and were later caught in the open by armored vehicles. The story of brave but supposedly foolish horsemen became useful propaganda for Germany, reinforcing the image of technological superiority and Polish backwardness. But it distorted the reality of a modern, if outmatched army doing its best under impossible conditions. Despite many acts of courage, the structural weaknesses of Poland's position quickly became apparent. German air superiority hampered Polish movement by day, smashed bridges, and disrupted communications. Some Polish commanders could no longer reach their units by telephone or telegraph and had to rely on runners or improvised radio links. Coordinating a coherent defense in such conditions was extremely difficult. Moreover, Poland's allies in the West did not move as quickly as many Poles had hoped. On September 3rd, Britain and France honored their guarantees and declared war on Germany, but their immediate military actions were limited. A small French advance into the Saar region soon halted, and there was no large-scale offensive that might have forced Hitler to divert major forces away from Poland. As German armored spearheads drove deeper eastward, large segments of the Polish army found themselves threatened with encirclement. In response, Polish commanders attempted several counterattacks. The largest of these came at the Bzura River, west of Warsaw, beginning on September 9th. Several Polish divisions struck the flank of advancing German forces, achieving initial success and forcing the Germans to divert reinforcements and air power to contain the threat. For days, fierce fighting raged along the riverbanks and in surrounding villages. Some Polish units managed to break out toward Warsaw, strengthening the capital's garrison. But the attacking forces themselves suffered heavy casualties and were eventually destroyed or forced to surrender. Meanwhile, the German advance tightened the noose around major cities. Krakow fell with relatively little resistance. Warsaw, however, prepared for a long siege. The capital's defenses were a mixture of regular army units, reservists, police, and volunteers. Men and women determined to defend their city despite shortages of modern equipment. German attempts to seize Warsaw quickly in early September were repulsed with significant losses, demonstrating that even a powerful modern army could struggle in urban combat if it lacked preparation and sufficient infantry. Frustrated, the German command decided to rely increasingly on artillery and air bombardment to break resistance. While Poland fought for survival against Germany, a new threat was about to materialize from the east. Under the terms of the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union was entitled to occupy eastern Poland once Germany had advanced sufficiently. In the first weeks of the war, Stalin hesitated. The Red Army was still recovering from the purges of its officer corps and dealing with tensions in the Far East, including clashes with Japanese forces in Mongolia. But as German units approached lines agreed upon in the secret deal, the Soviet leadership decided to act. On September 17, 1939, without a formal declaration of war, Soviet forces crossed the Polish frontier along a broad front. The Soviet government justified its actions with a diplomatic note claiming that the Polish state had ceased to exist and that Soviet forces were entering to protect Ukrainians and Belarusians supposedly left without defense. In reality, the Polish government and armed forces were still fighting, and the Soviet move amounted to a coordinated partition of the country with Nazi Germany. Polish units in the east were stunned. Some commanders, believing their only chance to continue the struggle lay in retreating toward neutral Romania or Hungary, tried to avoid large clashes with the Red Army, while others resisted on a local scale, particularly in places like Grodno, where Polish defenders fought Soviet tanks with improvised weapons such as gasoline bombs. On September 22nd, German and Soviet commanders even held a joint parade in the city of Brest-Litovsk to mark the handover of territory, with Red Army and Wehrmacht officers observing each other's troops. For observers abroad who grasped what was happening, it was a deeply unsettling image. Two regimes that presented themselves to the world as mortal enemies were now cooperating to dismember a sovereign state. As German and Soviet control expanded, the character of the conflict changed from a conventional campaign to a brutal occupation. From the outset, Nazi policy in Poland was not merely about defeating an enemy army. It was about reshaping society according to racial ideology. The German leadership considered Slavic Poles to be inferior and Polish Jews, who made up about 10% of the pre-war population, to be racially targeted for persecution and eventually annihilation. In the first weeks and months of occupation, German security forces, including SS units and special task groups known as Einsatzgruppen, systematically targeted Polish elites, officers, intellectuals, clergy, community leaders, for arrest and execution. They sought to decapitate society and prevent the organization of resistance. Violence was not limited to the SS. Regular army units sometimes carried out reprisal killings against civilians, often based on flimsy or fabricated accusations of partisan activity. In cities and towns such as Częstochowa and many others, Germans shot hostages, including Jews and non-Jewish Poles, in response to claimed attacks on their troops. By the end of the campaign, thousands of civilians had been murdered in such actions, not counting those killed in bombings and shelling. On the Soviet side, occupation policy was shaped by class warfare and suspicion toward anyone associated with the pre-war state. In eastern Poland, the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, arrested large numbers of Polish officers, policemen, landowners, teachers, and officials. Many were deported into the depths of the Soviet Union, others were imprisoned in camps. In 1940, thousands of Polish officers and intellectuals captured in 1939 would be executed in places such as Katyn, a crime denied by Soviet authorities for decades, while some non-Polish minorities, including some Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Jews, initially greeted Soviet troops as potential liberators from past discrimination. They soon discovered that Soviet rule brought its own system of repression and fear. Back on the battlefield, the last pockets of organized Polish resistance continued to fight into late September and early October. Warsaw endured a devastating siege. German artillery and air raids systematically destroyed large parts of the city, hitting not only military targets but also residential districts, hospitals, and infrastructure. Water, electricity, and food supplies became increasingly scarce. Civilians sheltered in cellars, listening to the thunder of explosions overhead and the distant rumble of tanks. The city's defenders, facing overwhelming firepower and little hope of relief from the west, nonetheless refused to surrender for weeks. Throughout this period, Polish hopes rested partly on the promised French offensive. Yet after a brief, limited advance in early September, French troops withdrew behind the Maginot Line, and the Western Front sank into a period of relative inactivity, sometimes called the Phony War. From the Polish perspective, there was nothing phony about the bombs falling on Warsaw or the massacres in the countryside. Radio appeals from the besieged city to Britain and France grew increasingly desperate, shifting from calls for help to demands for justice and revenge for the dead. On September 28th, after nearly 4 weeks of siege, Warsaw's defenders finally capitulated. Their decision was driven not only by exhaustion and encirclement, but by the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding among civilians, tens of thousands killed, many more wounded or homeless, disease and starvation looming. In the following days, other isolated Polish strongholds, including the Modlin Fortress and units fighting around the town of Koch, also laid down their arms. The last organized resistance ended in early October. The human cost of the campaign was staggering. Exact figures vary, but Polish military dead are usually estimated at between 70 and 120,000, with many more wounded and nearly 1 million taken prisoner by either German or Soviet forces. Civilian casualties in the campaign and early occupation ran into the hundreds of thousands, a grim prelude to the still greater losses the country would suffer in the years to come. German forces lost around 15,000 dead in the campaign and several hundred tanks, while Soviet losses were lower but still significant. When the guns fell silent over Poland in the autumn of 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had achieved their immediate objectives. Poland was partitioned, its government in exile, its territory transformed into occupation zones, administered according to brutal and often contradictory ideologies. In Berlin, Nazi propagandists presented the rapid collapse of Polish resistance as proof of the Wehrmacht's invincibility and of a new way of war. The term Blitzkrieg began to circulate, suggesting that Germany possessed a revolutionary doctrine of lightning war that could shatter any opponent. In reality, German generals themselves knew their army had been committed to war earlier than they had planned, that ammunition stocks were not limitless, and that they had benefited from a combination of surprise, superior mobility, and the political paralysis of the Western powers as much as from any single doctrine. For Poland, the invasion of 1939 was not a short episode, but the beginning of a long nightmare. Under German rule in the so-called general government and annexed western regions, Poles faced forced labor, expulsions, and increasingly systematic persecution. Polish Jews were herded into ghettos and later deported to extermination camps as the Holocaust unfolded. Under Soviet rule in the East, mass deportations, arrests, and political repression sought to break any potential opposition. Yet despite these hardships, Poland did not disappear as its occupiers had hoped. A government in exile formed first in France and later in London. Polish pilots would fight in the skies over Britain, sailors on Allied ships, soldiers in campaigns from North Africa to Italy and beyond. At home, one of the largest resistance movements in Europe took root, maintaining an underground press, education, and armed units despite ferocious reprisals. The German invasion of Poland in September 1939 is often summarized in a single sentence: the event that triggered World War II. That is factually correct, but it does not capture the full reality. The campaign was the culmination of 2 decades of unresolved tensions after World War I, of the rise of 2 brutal dictatorships that saw small nations as expendable, and of failed attempts by democracies to contain aggression without making hard sacrifices. It was also the opening chapter of a much larger story of occupation, resistance, and genocide that would devastate Eastern Europe. For the people who experienced it, the war did not begin as an abstract clash of alliances or ideologies. It began with the sound of sirens at dawn, the roar of aircraft overhead, the sudden appearance of foreign soldiers on familiar streets, and the realization that the fragile peace they had tried to protect was gone. When we look back at the invasion of Poland today, we see more than maps with arrows or statistics about divisions and casualties. We see individual lives, soldiers on both sides marching toward an uncertain fate, civilians fleeing burning villages, children hiding in cellars as buildings collapsed above them. We see the choices of leaders who played with the fate of nations, and the courage of ordinary people who tried to defend their homes in the face of overwhelming odds. The events of 1939 remind us that international order, however imperfect, can crumble quickly when powerful states decide that agreements and borders are mere obstacles to be swept aside. They also remind us that the consequences of such decisions are measured above all in human suffering. In the end, the German-Soviet victory in Poland was not the final word. Less than 2 years later, Germany would turn on its Soviet partner and launch an even larger invasion to the east. Britain and, eventually, the United States would mobilize fully for war. The conflict that began with bombs falling on Warsaw would engulf cities from Rotterdam to Hiroshima. But the core lesson of those first weeks remains. When the rights of smaller nations are treated as negotiable, and when violence is rewarded with concessions, the result is not stability, but a wider catastrophe. The story of the invasion of Poland is therefore not only a national tragedy, it is a warning written in the history of the 20th century, one that still speaks to us today.